Racism is alive and well in Australia. Last week, down in Melbourne, an Indigenous Australian football player reported to the police that his two young children were playing in their front yard when they were abused from a vehicle that went past using racial slurs. Unfortunately, this is not entirely unusual in Australia. There is still a deep streak of racism that runs through Australian society, although it's had various targets over time as different ethnic groups have moved into the country. But the local Indigenous people have always been a target of such racism. Several years ago, I dated a woman who lived in Australia but was born in South Africa, of Afrikaans people. She was very deeply religious. I would have thought somewhat obsessively and fanatically religious. And she had a deep hatred for people of colour, particularly black people as opposed to coloured people, because they're very keen in South Africa, as it seems to me in parts of North America as well, very keen in South Africa to make sure everyone fits into a nice group. So you were coloured or black or Indian or something. Black people in particular were despised by this woman. There's no gentler word to use. She came from a group of Afrikaans people who believe that they are a people chosen by God, given the South African nation by God, that the white race is a superior race and they are there to control, look after, however they interpret it, the lesser races. This was deeply embedded in her belief system, deeply embedded, one suspects, in her genetics. I was foolish enough to think that over time I might be able to open her mind to different ideas, but that was, of course, completely ridiculous and foolish, and in the end the relationship had absolutely no hope of proceeding. I've spoken here on this channel from time to time about these kinds of issues, about the deep tribalism that runs through human nature, that we all like to belong to a particular group, that this gives us a sense of security, of safety, and part of that seems inevitably to involve hostility towards other groups. That sounds like a very sophisticated explanation for why, in evolutionary terms, racism might exist, this tribalism, this sense of belonging. But the sad reality is that little people, small-minded people, are always going to have to belittle someone else to make themselves feel good. And that's generally, I think, what's going on with racism. Not so much this evolutionary factor, although that does exist, but really this psychological factor of someone who feels themselves to be inferior, to be of lesser status, of lesser quality, has to pick a group, has to find a group that they can regard themselves as superior to, better than. This is more of a psychological issue, I think, than an evolutionary issue. I certainly don't want to provide excuses for people who express these racist attitudes, whether they be evolutionary excuses or psychological excuses. I don't know what these people who need this, who need racism, went through in their younger days. But nothing gives them a reason to behave the way they do towards other people. People of a different colour, of a different ethnic background, of a different religious belief, whatever it may be. Colour's an easy and obvious one to see, so I guess that's why people choose it as their target. As I was talking then, something else came to my mind from many years ago. For a while I was still an Anglican minister, I worked as a chaplain in an Anglican girls' school, an all-ages girls' school. And one of my jobs as a chaplain was to take kind of religious instruction classes, if you like, with the Year 12 girls. And I tried to do this differently. I introduced them to other religious traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and so on. And I remember in one of the seminars that I used to run, because that's how it operated, I would run, I think, maybe a fortnightly seminar that would go for a couple of hours. During one of these seminars, I decided to discuss apartheid. It was a big issue at the time in the news. Unbeknownst to me, one of the girls in the group was actually from South Africa. She'd grown up on a small South African landholding, and they'd had black servants. She'd had a black nanny, and she was very upset by the discussion because she was adamant that they treated their black workers really well, that she really loved her black nanny, and so on. I really have no doubt about that. But of course, this raises the other question of racism, doesn't it? Not just the individual psychological element of racism, but the structural element of racism. These structures are sometimes overtly political, as they were in South Africa. Sometimes they're much more subtle, as they are, I suppose, in the USA, where, in theory at least, the political element of racism is now gone, but the structural elements remain firmly in place. And that's true also within Australia. Indigenous people are politically equal to us in every respect, but the realities of Australian society and the structures of Australian society are that the Indigenous people here still suffer from great disadvantages. Individually, we're not particularly responsible for that, and individually we may really love the black people or Indigenous people around us. Nevertheless, we remain part of the structures that make life difficult for people in, minority groups, maybe not even in minority groups. In South Africa, the black people were clearly not a minority group, but they were still held in their place by political and later social structures. And these social structures that remain in place are what make me angry about those who object to things like the Black Lives Matter movement, who will insist that all lives matter. The people who deny white privilege because they can look at the occasional poor white family. These people deny the structures that are still firmly in place, the social structures and economic structures that keep certain groups in society in a depressed state, where they have fewer opportunities than other people do. Of course, there are rich African American people in the United States. There are rich Indigenous people here. But by and large, this does not belie the social structures and economic structures that provide one group with more opportunities than another. So there are the two aspects to racism then. There is the social structures, the economic structures, as well as the overt political structures. But then there are the individual psychological structures that feed racism. The little people who need someone to belittle. These are very difficult issues to deal with at a political level, at a social level, at an economic level. I wouldn't pretend that they're easy, but I have no time for the small-minded people who just need someone to make them feel big.